So raids have changed a lot this expansion and over the years. Here are my 6 ways in which they have changed dramatically. Number 1. Where does your damage go? Raid bosses used to be relatively straightforward in terms of targets. You attacked a boss, sometimes adds appeared, and these would be either crowd controlled or killed with a higher priority than the boss. Once the adds were dead, you resumed damage on the boss. It was fairly simple, and although padding was still possible, overall damage output was generally a good thing. Now things have changed. There may be multiple adds up, but some have to be burst down quickly whilst others can be completely ignored. Blizzard have been quite clever into putting things like this into a fight to distract the meter whores, basically. Maximising your damage can now wipe your raid like never before. Now I often look through logs of heroic raids and see individuals consistently doing top damage in all fights. These heroic guilds probably think that these guys are amongst their best players, and in some cases they will be, clearly ready for the step up to mythic raiding. However, on closer inspection, you can see that some are standing in fire to maximise that damage or focusing whichever targets give them the best damage output, completely ignoring the add or adds that have to die immediately. When these players step into mythic, and I've seen this done, they fail badly, and often they don't understand why they're failing because the damage meter has win written all over it. But they're wiping the raid through failure to deal with mechanics that are simply a speed bump to heroic progress but a brick wall to mythic progress. Your best heroic raider may well be your worst mythic raider. When I'm reviewing my own performance as a DPS, I don't look at the overall damage, unless it's a single target fight like Gruul. I look at the damage breakdown on priority targets. For example, Aberrations and War Mages on Margok, the Mounts and Boss on Darmak, the Bellows Operator and Elementalists on Blast Furnace, etc. These days, whenever there are fights with adds, there are usually priority adds which need to be focused and others which can wait and are included specifically to distract your DPS meter monkeys, thus causing you to fail. For those who are heroic raiders and want to step up to mythic, this is very much the mode you have to get into. It's not always easy. The problem with heroic raiding is that it's often organised by heroic raid leaders. These guys may also think that the highest damage output is better than directed damage output, but it's something to focus on as soon as you leave a heroic guild to join a mythic one, and especially if leaving a low progress mythic guild for a higher progress one. Number 2, where's my battle res? So, in the old days you could battle res someone as long as living raid member had it off cooldown. In MOP you had a set number to use. In WoD you can only use one at the start and then earn more credits, for want of a better word, as you go through the fight. This isn't just a different way of implementing battle res into the game, it's a far more challenging one. Because before, if someone died early you'd get them up, and if someone else died you'd do the same. This allowed you to progress further into the fight and learn more quickly. Now, if a DPS dies and you res them, then a tank dies quite early on, you're probably screwed and have to wipe the whole thing. It's now really important to keep yourself alive, even when just starting to progress a fight, if your raid is going to get far enough in it to learn the mechanics. Number 3, how many? So the hardest mode raids were originally 40 man, nice and epic. In TBC they switched to 25 man. We then had a 10 man, 25 man split. This made it difficult to Blizzard to develop interesting mechanics because the 10 man guilds wouldn't have all the tools available. A single format of 20 man allows them to design all sorts of new mechanics with the expectation that every guild has the class and spec with the tools to deal with it. Now, personally, I think they went to 20 rather than 25 man because there was such a tribal war over the whole raid size thing that they didn't want to make it seem either side had won the argument. However, it now means that all hard mode raiders have the same problems that 10 man raiders had. You can't really slip up at all because being carried isn't an option. In 40 man raiding you could carry all sorts of mouth breathers and window lickers. You didn't need 40 to stay alive to beat the encounter, so variance in ability levels was huge. This was good in many ways though, as it meant you could raid with people who you liked from a social point of view, were nice people to have around, but weren't all that much good on the encounter. With 25 man this became a lot more punishing, and with 20 man even more so. As I say, something the former 10 man raiders were already familiar with. The encounters now seem to be very much designed such that all 20 players are playing well in order to beat it in a reasonable time. Personally, I think 20 is a bit too restrictive and a lot less epic. There are situations where a balanced roster struggles. This is particularly acute on the subject of healers and tanks. It's not always the case that a typical mythic guild has one of each class of healer, and definitely not one of each class of tank. As such, when one tank brings a huge advantage and you don't have that tank, you're going to lose world ranks through no fault of your own. Doing Iron Maidens without a Brewmaster? You've got it tough. Doing Mythic Blackhand with 2 shield tanks? That's too bad. Number 4, follow the leader. In previous expansions there were an awful lot of fights where there was a place to stand, and that's where you stood. Sometimes that place moved and you would follow the person assigned to lead the way. You know the guy, the one with the brain. Markers were introduced into the game to make this process even easier. All you had to do was follow this fella around, do your DPS, do your healing, do whatever. In WoD, however, and in Blackrock Foundry in particular, you're often responsible for your own positioning. Sure, there are still some fights where your position is determined for you, such as Orgorger and Gruul, but in the vast majority you have to deal with it yourself, and you don't always have a lot of room to move either. This means that a raid group now needs each raider to actually have their own brain in order to beat content in a timely manner. Number 5, heal me. So healing became much more directed. Of course, healing used to be directed in years gone by, but then raid groups usually had more healers to do that. Now we take only a handful of healers, usually not even a full group, and smart heals were tuned right down in WoD. Coupled with the fact that tanks lost a lot of their self-healing, this means that the good healers really stand out now. And what really stands out is there aren't as many of them as some may have thought. My personal thought is that the lack of very good healers is potentially a barrier to actually getting more people into mythic raiding, because it could be that the number of mythic raid guilds is capped by the number of good mythic raiders. I'm all for healers having to triage, however, and not just go through a rotation where they don't even know where their heals are headed. I mean, for God's sake, we might end up with heals going on to gnomes. However, it now does mean that guilds really struggle to get good healers, and this potentially, as I say, limits the number of guilds that are able to do that content. Number 6, split runs. So the very top guilds have always known that some fights would need loads of one class or spec, but few or none of another, but that it could all change in the next fight. This means you need far more raiding characters than a sensible roster will allow. The obvious solution is to have raid-ready alts, running the same raids multiple times a week on different characters whilst on farm, so you have whatever is needed on progress. Now this is one thing for the die-hard nutters, but not for the rest. It was possible to get very high ranks, rank World 50 and sort of, without having to resort to alts or anything like that. Now, however, alts are becoming more useful, more norm for split runs. It's becoming typical for mythic raiders to have an alt in order to run normal and heroic mode twice during the week at least, and it means that you can funnel gear into your main raiders. You effectively, if you do two split runs, double the amount of gear you can funnel into those raiders. Okay, it's taking advantage of the new flex style to normal and heroic mode, and is something that more and more mythic guilds are going to have to do. Now, I'm not saying that most mythic raiders are doing this at the moment, but it is far more than it was in the past, and as the benefit becomes obvious, you would expect it to become more and more the norm and the model of a mythic raiding guild's preparation for the new raid tier. So, those are my 6 ways in which raiding has changed with WoD. Now to carry on writing that book, 101 uses for a gnome corpse.